What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
That morning, when Mom let the keys sing against her manicured knuckles like a tiny wind chime and smirked as if the sun had just punched in for Emily specifically, she slid a single bright silver blade onto my sister's palm and said, with the kind of proud hush people reserve for church or stock tips, that they had bought her a house, and I swear I felt the kitchen tilt even though the floor was the same ceramic I scrubbed last Thanksgiving while everyone else watched football, so I did what I have trained myself to do since middle school award nights and college move-in days and every lopsided holiday since. I didn't react, I breathed, I watched. And I filed every micro-expression into the mental cabinet where I keep the family's greatest hits of selective generosity. Mom's smile was the glossy kind you get after a salon blowout and a decisive text from a realtor. Dad stood behind her with the pleased, managerial grin of a man who loves spreadsheets and the phrase sound investment, while Emily was already angling the key toward the morning light for a photo that would later appear with a caption about gratitude and new chapters, and I took in the scene the way a paramedic scans a crash site, not for the drama, but for the pressure points. Because if there is one thing I learned paying my own tuition with 2 jobs and a stubborn scholarship while Emily workshop cried her way into temporary breaks between semesters, it's that every gorgeous announcement carries a seam, and seams beg to be tugged. Mom launched into the script about adulthood and stability and how a woman needs roots, sprinkling compliments like garnish on an overpriced entree, and Dad added the fiscal responsibility sermon, noting how the neighborhood was up and coming, and how locking in a fixed rate showed foresight, and Emily actually wiped a performative tear with her French-tipped ring finger, then asked if the house came with a wine fridge because her followers love aesthetic storage, and I almost laughed except the laugh would have come out like a bark, so I reached for the coffee pot and poured slowly enough to look calm while my heart beat an emergency tap code that spelled out, in all caps, this again. Somewhere between Dad's explanation of escrow and Mom's reminiscence about how hard it is for young women today, I saw the breadcrumb they always drop without noticing, the one that says they believe I will absorb the slight and carry on like a reliable appliance. And I remembered the Christmas when Emily got a bow-tied SUV and I unwrapped socks with pine trees because you're practical, sweetheart, and the April when my appendectomy bill arrived with interest while Mom sent Emily to a beach house to recover from a rough patch, and I felt that familiar blend of ache and clarity settle in, that little voice that is not bitter so much as extremely awake, saying this is a pattern and patterns are just habits with costumes, and honestly, I can forgive habit, but I never let costume win. I congratulated Emily in a tone even I would have believed, hugged Mom long enough to smell her citrus perfume and the faint victory of fresh printer ink, and told Dad the interest rate sounded smart. Then carried my coffee to the sink where the window frames our fence like a picture of boundaries we ignore, and while they took photos, I rinsed my mug, dried it, placed it back with surgical neatness, and started the tiny choreography I do when I'm done being handled. I slipped my phone from my cardigan pocket and scrolled, not for distraction, but for tools, because if they wanted a pageant I would give them a clinic. Here is the part where people will disagree with me and I understand why, because retaliation, even cleverly plated, always looks too spicy when the announcement smells like cinnamon rolls, yet there is a difference between vandalism and architecture. And what I build with paperwork and light. So while Emily debated whether her housewarming should be wine cheese or tacos beer, I opened the banking app where, years ago, after the first family emergency, I had linked one of my accounts to my parents' business checking as a safety net, a quiet auto transfer that covered the occasional overdraft when the restaurant had a slow weekend or Dad got ambitious with seasonal decor, and I remembered how grateful they had been that first time. How Mom called me our rock, and how quickly that gratitude turned into expectation that never remembered my name when it bought gifts with ribbons. I checked the activity and saw the familiar hiccups, the little midnight pulls that kept their balance from wheezing into fees, and I thought about keys and who gets them and why, and how silence can be a kind of locksmithing if you are patient. And then I navigated to the permissions page and removed my account as an authorized backstop, Not because I wanted to watch them skid, but because I was done being the invisible traction they never credited, and in the same careful breath I scheduled a formal notice to the bank, simple, polite, airtight, revoking the automatic transfer agreement I had established, effective immediately, with a confirmation receipt that would make any compliance officer nod. Does that make me cruel, to pull away a safety net on the same morning my sister posed with her new front door jewelry? Maybe, if you think the net was a gift and not a leash, but I know the difference between support and subsidy. And I know the tone people use when they call you independent as a compliment that doubles as a coupon, and I also know that I am allowed to retire from being everyone's quiet scaffolding without sending a press release, so I hit confirm. Watched the status shift from enabled to terminated, and felt the strangest sense of oxygen flood my ribs. Emily cleared her throat theatrically and announced that the house had subway tile and a bay window for morning journaling. Mom clasped her hands like a pageant director seeing the crown land perfectly. Dad declared that this is what responsible parents do. And I tucked my phone away, smiled just enough to pass, and offered to pick up pastries for the drive to go see the place, which Mom accepted with a gracious little nod because I am so helpful, and when I stepped into the hallway to grab my bag, I texted one more message, a perfectly civil note to the utilities company contact I know from my job, requesting a standard verification call on any third-party auto-debit attempts tied to my name or my business. A tiny firewall that cost me nothing and would cost someone else a habit. By the time we reached the driveway, sunlight had burnished the key into a prop worthy of a commercial. Emily was already rehearsing the door unlocking shot for her story, and Mom whispered that she hoped I wasn't feeling left out because your life is so different. And I told her the truth, that my life is in fact extremely different, then opened the passenger door, slid in, and clicked the seatbelt with the calm of a pilot who knows the runway is short, but the weather is on her side. Because the first move had been made, the kind you cannot photograph, the kind that does not ask permission, and while their morning blossomed into a tour of someone else's choices, mine narrowed into a smile with edges sharp enough to cut ribbon. Which is another way of saying that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a family tradition is to let it meet its own weight, and sometimes the pettiest revenge is simply removing the invisible floor and listening for the quiet it leaves behind. By the time the congratulatory texts began pinging our family thread with glittery hearts and exclamation marks and photos of Emily pressing the key to her cheek like a prom corsage, I had already built myself a small office on my kitchen table with a legal pad, a pen that writes like it knows secrets, and a laptop that remembers everything I have ever asked it to remember, and I started the ritual I call the audit of my life. Not because I am an accountant, though I could probably pass the vibe check at a tax seminar, but because I learned early that if you are going to survive a family that calls you independent as a way to write you out of the budget, you need to keep your own ledger and you need to know, down to the last penny and the last favor, what you have paid for and whose comfort it purchased. I pulled up bank records that read like a diary no one thought I kept, transfer after transfer timed to coincide with slow weekends at the restaurant and ambitious decor seasons, and the occasional, unexpected expense that somehow always followed a trip Emily absolutely deserved because mental health matters, and as the numbers spelled out long months of buffer after buffer, I felt something like grief for the version of me who thought being the reliable one would eventually earn a chair at the table and not just a folding seat in the hallway, so I started printing, not to wallpaper their guilt, but to build a spine for mine, and I stapled each month with a thin, satisfying bite that sounded like a metronome saying never again. Because life is not only numbers, I added the soft things that look like fluff until you measure them, screenshots of text threads where Mom praised my resilience, while asking if I could float a utility bill for a week, and the email where Dad thanked me for being our quiet partner after I covered the liquor supplier so an anniversary party wouldn't crash, and the message from Emily, chirpy with gratitude the week she upgraded her phone, saying I'm a lifesaver and she'll totally pay me back when brand deal money hits, which, unsurprisingly, has the punctuality of a unicorn bus, and I slipped each printout into a transparent sleeve, because if I've learned anything from office supply stores it's that dignity sometimes looks like plastic. While the printer hummed, I took the smallest detour to a site that every adult should treat like a smoke detector, the place where you pull a credit report and check it like a hawk with reading glasses. Because the last time I gave our family the benefit of the doubt, I found a store card I had never applied for linked to my maiden address for convenience, and I promised myself then that I would never again be the convenience, so I locked my credit, set alert thresholds that would wake the dead and certainly me, and added a fraud notification not because I have proof of villainy, but because I have proof of habits, and habits write their names in pencil until you bring permanent ink. People love to say that forgiveness is freedom, and I believe them on Sundays and after a good meal, but freedom in the middle of a Tuesday requires forms, so I dug up the old email Dad sent the year the restaurant hit a rough patch and used the subject line, "Temporary cash cushion," the one where he typed that he would repay me when the seasonal menu landed, and I paired it with the simple draft I made back then, a polite promissory note that I never pushed across the table because I was still auditioning for Daughter of the Year, and I updated the dates and the totals to reflect the years of cushions that became mattresses everyone stretched out on without ever asking me how my back felt. Then I printed that too. 3 copies on the heavy paper I save for moments when I want people to feel the weight of their own handwriting. I took a breath that felt like a hinge and drove to the strip mall where the notary sits behind a glass door between a shipping store and a dry cleaner, the kind of place you use when you want things to be both official and unremarkable. And I signed in front of a woman who didn't care about my family saga yet stamped my pages with the same gravity she gives to divorces and car titles and messy inheritances, which is to say, all the quiet paperwork of love and money, and I thanked her. Slid the stamped copies into a manila envelope as thick as my patience used to be, and labeled it in the tidy block letters that used to decorate Emily's science fair posters back when my job was to cut the trifold straight while she sparkled under fluorescent gym lights. Because revenge without humor tastes like aspirin, I allowed myself one small flourish and went to the shipping counter to buy those old-fashioned green return receipt cards, the ones that make men who like to be in charge suddenly reach for reading glasses. And I addressed an outer jacket to Dad at his office with a mild subject, financial housekeeping, and a tone so civil it could host a garden party, yet I did not mail it, because timing is the difference between a fizzle and a firework. And I wanted the pop where everyone could hear it, so I tucked the addressed jacket into my tote, slid the sealed inner envelope beside it like a backup parachute, and drove home rehearsing the kind of calm smile that ruins a bully's day without ever raising your voice. If you are reading this and thinking I sound calculating, you are not wrong, but calculations are how you keep the roof above your head when people who claim to love you treat your labor like weather, pleasant when it cools them, inconvenient when it rains on their plans, and as the sun rolled out its afternoon glare I poured myself water, opened the county recorder's website, and ran a simple search for our last name, not out of suspicion, just out of a responsible curiosity that any adult with a shared family history of creative financing has earned, and when a few entries returned with familiar addresses and one unfamiliar one that made my scalp prickle because I recognized the street from Emily's Pinterest board, I bookmarked the page, took a screenshot for the folder, and let the idea settle that maybe the key she held so triumphantly had a story carved into its teeth that none of them had bothered to read. By evening I had a clean binder with months lined like vertebrae, a notarized note that turned my kindness into something with a spine, and a slim stack of return receipt cards that would, at the right moment, perform like stage lights. And I set the binder on my bookshelf where the economics texts live, not because I worship money, but because I respect what it can do when you name it correctly. Then I placed the manila envelope in the center of my dining table like a centerpiece only I could see, and I texted Mom a breezy acceptance for the house celebration she was planning for this weekend, punctuated by a smiley I did not feel, adding that I'd bring a tart from that bakery she likes, which made her send back 3 hearts and a line about how I always know how to make things nice. And I looked at the envelope, tapped it once with my thumbnail the way you test a melon for ripeness, and decided, with a calm that felt almost luxurious, that tomorrow I would pick up one more document. From the title office, purely for clarity, purely for peace, purely because if a key can sing, our record can speak, and I wanted to hear exactly what this one was trying so hard to tell me. The housewarming felt less like a celebration and more like a soft launch for a product my parents believed they had engineered to perfection, a lifestyle capsule featuring my sister as the aspirational face and a freshly minted front porch as the brand promise. So when I parked down the street and followed the string of rental cars and catered platters toward the cheerful door with its seasonal wreath and carefully scattered welcome stones, I reminded myself that I was not here to argue with decor or to be the polite sister who holds purses while people congratulate the person who never remembers where she left them. I was here as the uninvited guest who arrives with a smile, a bakery box, and the quiet kind of curiosity that has a way of pulling loose threads without musing the sweater. Inside, the air smelled like candles with names that sound like hand creams. Emily floated between clusters of acquaintances narrating the tile choices in a voice she usually reserves for unboxing videos. Mom hovered with trays as if good parenting were measured in Capri skewers, and Dad, who loves nothing more than the timbre of his own competence, guided a small knot of men through a tour whose highlight reel included the phrase fixed rate pronounced like a toast. And while I hugged, nodded, and offered compliments that did not cost me a scrap of self-respect, I let my eyes do what they do best, taking inventory the way a locksmith studies hinges, because houses tell on their owners almost immediately, and this one, for all its fresh paint and staged throws, wore its paperwork too close to the surface for someone like me not to notice. On the refrigerator, secured under a magnet shaped like a pineapple because apparently hospitality requires fruit with a crown, someone had clipped a welcome packet from the Homeowners Association with the kind of confidence people have when they assume rules exist for other people, a neat stack of bylaws, fee schedules, and a one-page summary titled Occupancy and Use That. To most guests, would read like noise, but to me sang a small, interesting tune about primary residence requirements and restrictions on short-term rentals and a line about owner-occupied status that, if you've ever sat across from a loan officer who wants to see you live where you say you will, lands with a dull, unmistakable weight. And I did not need a law degree to read between lines that had been bolded for convenience. While Dad poured coffee and told a cousin that this neighborhood was the smart play because people want stability, not fads, I drifted toward the kitchen island where a labeled binder sat open, because of course a labeled binder sat open. My father is a man who laminates, and peeking from a plastic sleeve like a shy guest was a copy of an occupancy affidavit with his signature above a line that promised, in clear, unfussy language, that the borrower intended to occupy the property as a primary residence within a set number of days, and I could almost feel the house lean in to hear whether I would whisper what everyone else in the room was too busy being happy to think about, namely, that this pretty arrangement, which had been framed as a gift to my sister and a triumph of parental planning, stood on a small, fragile promise that contradicted the very premise of Emily's life and content calendar and the words she had just spoken 3 feet away when she told a neighbor she would keep her downtown apartment because it had better light for filming. If you want to make people angry, correct them in public. If you want to make them accountable, give paperwork a stage. So I smiled at my aunt, set my tart on the counter, and borrowed the binder as if I had been asked to admire laminate thickness, turning the pages with a reverence that would have made Dad proud if he had been watching, which he wasn't, because he had stepped onto the back deck to hold court about property taxes, and I used the moment to slide my phone beneath the lip of the island and take 3 clear photos: the occupancy affidavit with loan number visible, the HOA page that prohibited short-term rentals without board approval, and the welcome letter listing the community manager's direct line in a font even a half-asleep adult could dial correctly. Emily, flushed with attention and Prosecco, pulled me aside to ask whether the bay window made her look too suburban, and I told her truthfully that she looked like someone who had never read a mortgage rider in her life, which she took as a compliment because the world has trained her to interpret any sentence ending in her reflection as praise. Then she launched into a plan about turning the guest room into a studio and hosting pop-up brand weekends with friends who would crash on the couch. after their live streams, and in the gentle pause where a sister might have said be careful or maybe slow down, I said nothing, because I prefer to place bumpers in the lane and let the ball reveal its own spin. I excused myself to take a quick call, stepped into the tidy garage that still smelled like cardboard and ambition, and dialed the community manager listed on the letter. A woman whose voice had the steady crispness of someone who has seen every version of enthusiasm turning into entitlement, and I introduced myself as a neighbor attending a housewarming. Asked a few naive questions about guest policies and filming traffic and whether weekend rental activity ran afoul of any clauses, and listened while she, pleased to be useful on a Saturday, referenced the exact section I had photographed and explained the board's process for addressing violations, including friendly notices that escalate to fines and, if needed, legal action that involves the mortgage holder when occupancy certifications are at risk, at which point I thanked her, asked whether email was preferred for flagging potential conflicts early, and received an address with the kind of cheerfulness that suggested she enjoys preventing fires more than extinguishing them. Some people believe revenge must roar to qualify, yet I have always found that a courteous whisper into the right intercom carries farther, so I returned to the party, cut generous slices of tart, complimented the backsplash, and, between bites and banter, drafted a short, neighborly email to the community manager summarizing the celebratory chatter I had heard about pop-up weekend rentals and content shoots, attached the photo of the relevant bylaw page, CC'd the general mailbox listed for compliance so no one could claim a missed memo, and closed with a line about wishing to preserve the peaceful character of the block, which was not sarcasm so much as a statement of values that, as of this morning, finally included mine. Because every chess move needs a second piece to lock the board, I set a delayed send on a second message composed with a tone so respectful it squeaked. Addressed to the lender's occupancy review address, I located in 2 taps from the loan number and bank name printed on the affidavit, asking for clarification on whether hosting regular brand events and maintaining a separate apartment for work would affect the borrower's primary residence certification, attaching the same photos and inviting them to advise the homeowner on best practices to remain in good standing, and then I slipped my phone back into my pocket, raised a glass when someone called for a toast, and watched Dad beam like a man whose ducks are marching in formation, unaware that one of them had just encountered a very polite fence. When the evening thinned and the last guests wandered to their cars with leftover cookies and compliments, Emily stood in her doorway holding that bright key like a talisman and told me I was the only one who really gets her, which is both true and irrelevant. And Mom whispered that she hoped I saw how this was a responsible choice, and Dad clapped my shoulder in a way that men use when they believe the world is finally behaving according to plan, and I hugged them with all the warmth required by decency, then walked to my car under a sky that had the exact hard shine of new enamel, sat behind the wheel, and felt the buzz of my phone as 2 automated replies landed with bureaucratic punctuality. One confirming that the association had logged my note and would review it at the next business hour. The other acknowledging receipt from the lender's quality control inbox with a case number that nested elegantly into the screenshots already filed in my binder, after which I turned the key, let the engine settle, and smiled the kind of private smile that looks like nothing from the outside, then glanced at the sealed manila envelope on the passenger seat and reached over to tap it once like a conductor's baton, because the music had started. And tomorrow, when Dad opened an envelope of his own, the downbeat would finally be his to count. The dinner that Mom framed as a simple family night with pot roast and a side of modest pride arrived dressed like a ceremony, with the good plates resurrected from the china cabinet and cloth napkins pressed within an inch of their lives, while Emily floated in wearing a sweater the color of late peaches and Dad paced with the showman energy of a man who has prepared remarks, and I, having already stacked my quiet dominoes, walked in with a bakery box that bought me goodwill and a tote that looked like any other tote but carried, in its neat interior, the manila envelope I had fed with documentation until it felt like a small, benevolent anvil, so when Mom kissed my cheek and murmured that she hoped tonight would feel healing, I tucked the box under my arm, smiled in a way that could pass on a postcard, and replied that I was very much looking forward to clarity, which, if said with enough warmth, does not sound like a threat. We ate in the polite rhythm of people who know that dessert is merely a bridge to the real performance, and while Dad filled the pauses with responsible parent anecdotes and references to compound growth that he seemed to believe should be engraved on his tombstone, Emily explained her content calendar and asked whether the HOA would mind a soft launch event next month if the playlist stayed tasteful, and Mom told a story about her own mother saving green stamps to buy a blender, as if nostalgia could be legal tender in the present, and I participated as if I were not counting heartbeats between the moment the plates would clear and the moment the envelope would take the stage, all the while watching the phones they kept face down beside their forks, waiting for the small interruptions I had invited with such care that even I had to admire the choreography. When Mom stood to retrieve the apple crisp and Dad rose with her, clearing his throat with theatrical significance, the first vibration traveled across the wood like a timid earthquake. Dad's phone shimmying to announce an email from a quality control inbox at a major lender with a subject line that, while bland to civilian ears, hits the adrenal system of anyone who has signed an occupancy certification. Asking in courteous corporate language for clarification on residency intent in light of potential business uses described by a neighbor, and I watched his eyes flick to the screen, watched the calculation cloud his confidence before he ordered it back into the wings with a forced chuckle about spam that never stops, and then, as if on cue, the house line rang with a chirp I remember from high school, Mom answering with the relaxed smile of a woman who expects a volunteer coordinator and receiving instead a community association representative leaving a message about friendly reminders related to owner-occupied properties and the scheduling of brand events that may require prior board review, the voice so cordial that only someone who has ever been politely warned would hear the iron in its silk. I let the second vibration come and go, watched Dad silence the phone as if quiet screens erase obligations, and took that small breath I take before difficult meetings at work, then slid the manila envelope from my tote and placed it on the table with the unremarkable grace of someone setting down a book, saying, "Dad, since we are in a season of responsible choices, and because I love not leaving loose ends, I brought something for you to open when dessert is on the table so your blood sugar can cushion your feelings," which made Mom laugh and Emily roll her eyes and gave Dad the opportunity to perform magnanimity by accepting the gesture with that big pal smile he saves for men he thinks he outranks, and he reached for the clasp like it was a mailer from a charity. The weight surprised him, which pleased me more than it should have, because heft in a document is dignity that can be felt by people who respect only what strains their wrists, and as he loosened the flap and slid the contents free, the dining room, which had been so full of victorious air, narrowed to the sound of pages shifting and a cinnamon sugar perfume that suddenly felt like a cover story, and he met the first page, the notarized note with its tidy principal and calmly accrued interest, and the second, the ledger of transfers and dates that read like a family biography written in debits and kindness, and the third, the termination confirmation from the bank that severed the quiet lifeline he had forgotten to recognize, and the fourth, the title office printout with that delicate highlight on the occupancy affidavit number that matched the lender's email now glowing on his locked screen like a distant ambulance, and the fifth, an index card with 3 lines, each one a date. Each date paired with an amount that never made its way back to me despite promises, each line ending in the simple phrase settled by month's end, written in the tidy, merciless penmanship I learned writing thank you notes for birthday money I was not allowed to spend. His smile, which had held fast through the HOA call and the lender's politely pointed inquiry, did not exactly disappear so much as lose its scaffolding, and the corners tried to stay aloft out of habit while the middle obeyed gravity. And in that shift I saw the man who loves being competent meet the man who has been casually careless with someone else's confidence, and I did not gloat, because the point here was not humiliation, the point was recognition and adjustment, the point was a recalibration of the instruments that control who gets celebrated and who gets used as a silent stabilization mechanism, so I poured water, waited for him to finish the third page, and said, in a voice meant to sound like a meeting and not a reckoning, that I would like the amounts repaid on the 3 dates indicated, that I had chosen dates that align with quarterly vendor cycles to make timing easier, and that, separately, I would be forwarding copies of the occupancy documentation to his email, because it seemed wise to ensure alignment between the story we tell at dinner and the promises we sign when money is on the line. Emily objected on cue, calling me dramatic and suggesting that family doesn't invoice family, which, given her lifelong scholarship in parental benevolence, made me smile in a way I regretted, but I kept my eyes on Dad, because he, not she, is the one who taught me that accountability is grown-up love, and I added that the binder cataloging the transfers sits on my bookshelf and will remain there unless someone prefers a more public repository, a sentence that, to an audience of men who value discretion, lands with the force of an entire ethics committee, and Mom tried to pantomime peacemaking by asking whether we could just talk about feelings, yet the phones hummed again. Another lender auto-acknowledgement blooming on Dad's screen beside the HOA follow-up email promising a friendly visit next week, and the room, scented with apples and principal, felt like a stage where the lights have finally found the right face. He placed the papers back into the envelope with the careful hands of a person who has realized that paper can, under the right circumstances, feel heavier than stone, and he said we would discuss terms after dessert, which I accepted with a nod that was almost generous. Then I lifted my glass, congratulated Emily on the bay window and the future she believes it guarantees, and added that the best part of getting a key is learning exactly what it opens and what it doesn't, a line that drifted across the table like steam from the crisp, and while Mom pretended not to understand and Emily declared she didn't appreciate riddles at the dinner table, I watched Dad glance again at the third page where the bank confirmation sat like a closed door, and I set my fork down, folded my napkin, and waited for the moment after he tasted the dessert, because sweetness pairs beautifully with reality, and because tomorrow morning, when he meets the bank on the phone and the association in person and the dates on my index card, I intend to be in the room with a calm smile and a pen that writes like it knows how this ends. Morning arrived with the brittle brightness that follows a storm no one will admit happened, and while coffee climbed the kitchen air and the neighborhood scraped its driveways back into normal, I sat at the table with the manila envelope reassembled into a tidy stack and watched Dad pace the length of the room like a man conducting negotiations with the past, the present, and a customer service queue that insists on recorded lines. And when his phone connected to a loan officer whose politeness could slice paper, I listened to him try on versions of the truth as if one would finally fit. First the version where this was a misunderstanding, then the version where an overenthusiastic neighbor had mistaken celebration for commerce, and at last the version where he said the word certify with the same care people use when handling glass, because the officer had already read him the line where intent becomes perjury if you sign it without meaning it, after which he stared at the floor in a new silence that did not invite rescue and said he would follow up by day's end with an amended plan, which is the corporate phrase for do not make me write this down without a path out. Emily, who experiences accountability like a foreign film without subtitles, began a monologue about artistic freedom and property rights and how social media isn't real in the way rules are real, which was almost funny if you enjoy irony infused with entitlement, and Mom moved between us with her palms raised as if traffic could be directed by maternal gesture alone, yet the rhythm of the morning refused to be calmed by choreography, because the house line rang with a cheerful reminder from the association about a brief meeting to review community use guidelines, and my inbox chimed with the delivery of a time-stamped acknowledgement from the lender's quality team that placed words like review and verification beside our last name in a way that finally made everyone at the table look at the same page. So I laid out two paths with the gentleness I reserve for clients who are right at the edge of admitting what they already know, the first being a legitimate owner-occupant course correction in which the borrower actually moves into the property, logs the days, and stops treating the living room as a set, and the second being a clean refinance that names the gift for what it is. An investment property with rules and taxes and endlessly fewer fairy lights, and I told them I would support either. provided the 3 repayment dates on my card were honored without choreography and the quiet lifeline I had provided ceased to exist in both memory and practice. Dad sat, hands tented in front of his lips as if prayer could be reverse-engineered into policy, and after a length of silence that used to frighten me and now simply measured my patience, he nodded in a way that made the room feel marginally safer, then asked whether there was anything else in the envelope he needed to understand before he started making calls that would offend several vendors, a cousin, and a certain version of his pride, and I told him yes, there was one more thing, and slid across the table a single sheet that had worried the corners of my tote all week, a draft UCC financing statement that named my earlier emergency loans as secured by specific non-essential restaurant equipment, bar coolers, accent lighting, seasonal decor, together with a cover letter I had written in a voice so professional it could have worn a navy suit, explaining that the filing would only be recorded in the absence of repayment on the dates specified, and that its purpose was not public shaming but private order, a way to keep love and money from touching in the dark and multiplying into confusion. Mom looked at the paper as if it might bruise, and Emily, who does not like props that do not flatter, scoffed that I was threatening the family, which made me laugh in a single exhale I did not mean to release, because if a boundary looks like a threat to you, chances are you have enjoyed unmetered access to other people's labor, and Dad, to his credit, read the page all the way to the filing office address, placed it back on the table, and said the sentence I had been starving to hear since my scholarship year, that he had confused silence with consent and competence with abundance, that he owed me money and something less measurable, and that he would repay the first and wrestle with the second even if it stretched him in ways that did not photograph well, after which he asked whether I had already filed the statement, and I told him the truth, that a stamped envelope sat in my bag, that a calendar reminder lived in my phone, and that my finger could cancel both in the same second. It could let them fly. The day lengthened around errands that acquired new names, compliance visit, lender follow-up, vendor rescheduling, and I let them move through their logistics without me while I took my own small pilgrimage to the water's edge, where the wind writes common sense on cheeks whether they want it or not, and I stood with my shoes sinking a fraction into the damp sand and thought about fairness, which is not, contrary to inspirational posters, a scale that balances itself when you pose nicely beside it, but rather a thing you build one policy at a time, one sworn statement at a time, one refusal to subsidize other people's ideals at a time. And I decided that I did not need anyone at that table to like my methods so long as they stopped relying on it without naming it, a decision that felt less like vengeance and more like hygiene, which might be the only kind that lasts. Night returned us to the living room where apologies and logistics had been arranged in stacks like laundry sorted by color, and Dad handed me 3 post-dated checks with memos that named debts as debts. Mom placed her palm over mine with a tremor that suggested a new understanding of fragility, and Emily asked, in a voice that for once had no performance in it, whether I was going to ruin her launch. To which I answered that the association and the lender would set the boundaries and that I had no appetite for ruin when compliance would do, and she nodded like a person encountering the word consequence as something other than a moral of a story, then said she would figure it out like I always did, which sounded like envy and faint admiration braided into a tone I did not recognize from her mouth. He opened my envelope again, not the fat one but the single-page draft, turned it over as if the back might offer mercy, and asked whether I would let the filing die if the dates were met and the occupancy truth was told without makeup. And I said yes, because yes is cheaper than the kind of victory that leaves rubble, then took the stamped envelope from my bag, placed it on the coffee table where a magazine tried to sell us an easier life, and rested my finger on the corner long enough for everyone to see that power can look like paper doing nothing if it sits in the hands of someone who will not be hurried, after which I slipped it back into my tote and stood to leave, saying that I would see them on the first date, that I would answer the association politely if they called, and that I would not be attending any soft launches until the house learned who lived in it. Driving home under a sky that had finally exhaled, I thought about how stories end in books and how they end in kitchens, which is to say not with confetti but with schedules and signatures, and a quieter appetite for being applauded by people who never clap when the lights are off. And when I reached my apartment, I placed the draft in my desk drawer beside the binder and the card with the 3 tidy dates, then turned off the lamp and let the room rehearse its ordinary, and in that soft dark eye, did not decide whether I had simply frightened them into decency or opened a door I might yet have to walk through with a stamped envelope in my hand, because some endings are less a period than a held breath, and sometimes the most honest answer you can give, even to yourself, is to keep the key in your pocket and listen to the lock think about you.